The 7 palaces Sha'ar HaGilgulim stand among the most profound teachings of the Ari, Rabbi Isaac Luria Ashkenazi, the towering figure of 16th century Kabbalah whose revelations transformed Jewish mysticism. Emerging in Seif during the latter half of the 16th century, the Ari's teachings arose from an intricate synthesis of earlier mystical systems. The Holy Zohar, the Merkava tradition, the Lurianic school of Tikkun, and Sha'ar HaGilgulim, and the philosophical insights of earlier Kabbalists such as Rabbi Moshe Cordovero and Rabbi Yosef Jikatilla. The Ari's contribution was not merely a reinterpretation, but an entirely new metaphysical architecture, an inner cosmos that described the dynamics of creation, exile, and redemption as processes that occur both cosmically and within the depths of the human soul. It is within this framework that the 7 palaces appear as a central doctrine, not merely as a mystical schema but as the very map of the soul's inner chambers, each palace representing a stage in the spiritual ascent, realm of divine consciousness, and a chamber of the soul's purification and rectification. The 7 palaces are first known to us through the works of Rabbi Chayyim Vital, the chief disciple and transcriber of the Ari's oral teachings, especially in Etz Chaim and Sha'ar HaGilgulim. Vital presents them not as isolated doctrines, but as an integral part of the Ari's metaphysics, intimately tied to the doctrine of Tzimtzum, the primordial contraction of divine light, and the cosmic drama of the shattering of the vessels, Sha'ar HaGilgulim, and their rectification, Tikkun. The palaces emerge as stages within this rectification process, not merely cosmological realities, but spiritual realities that correspond to chambers of the human soul. They are the inner architecture of the divine light as it descends into the world, and as the soul ascends in return. This is not abstract metaphysics alone, it is a living, experiential structure. For the Ari, Kabbalah was not a set of intellectual doctrines, but a system for the conscious elevation of the soul, and the 7 palaces are a profound symbol of that journey. The term Palace of Zeir Anpin itself is drawn from the Hebrew mystical tradition, in which palace signifies not a mere dwelling but a sacred chamber of divine revelation. In earlier mysticism, especially the Merkava tradition, the divine realm was conceived as a series of heavenly palaces, each more exalted than the last, through which the mystic ascends in visions of heavenly ascent, Aliyah. The Ari recontextualizes this motif within his own mystical architecture, mapping the palaces inward rather than outward, situating them as inner states of the soul rather than merely spatial realms of the divine world. They are thus both cosmological and psychological, representing the microcosm of the human soul in relation to the macrocosm of divine reality. The number 7 itself is of great symbolic importance in Kabbalah. 7 represents completeness in the manifest order. There are 7 days of creation, 7 lower Sephirot, 7 heavens, 7 notes of the cosmic scale, 7 planetary spheres in earlier mystical cosmologies, 7 attributes of the soul, and 7 levels of holiness. This number signifies both completion and the full cycle of spiritual ascent. In the context of the 7 palaces, it signifies the entire architecture of the soul's dwelling, a complete structure through which divine light passes and through which the soul can ascend to reunite with its source. Each palace is not merely a stage, but a chamber with its own inner structure, its own quality of light, its own corresponding faculties of the soul, and its own rectifications to undergo. Together they form a ladder of ascent, a process that mirrors the cosmic tikkun, the rectification of creation itself. In Lurianic terms, the cosmos is in a state of exile and fragmentation. The divine light was once whole, but through the primordial contraction and the shattering of the vessels, it descended into concealment and division. The purpose of creation, from the Lurianic perspective, is the rectification of these shards of divine light. This rectification is a process not only of the cosmos, but of the soul. The soul itself must traverse these palaces, refine itself, gather the scattered sparks of holiness, nitsatzit, and elevate them until it returns to the fullness of the divine. The 7 palaces are thus both cosmological and sidereological. They describe the structure of the worlds and the inner structure of the human soul. They are the hidden architecture of the spiritual ascent. The Ari teaches that the soul is clothed in these palaces as garments, layers of spiritual reality that must be traversed and purified in order for the soul to achieve union with the divine. Each palace is associated with a different level of the soul: Nefesh, Ruach, Neshama, Chaya, and Yechida. These are the 5 levels of the soul in Kabbalah, and the palaces map them onto 7 stages of ascent. In this way, the 7 palaces form a bridge between the soul's internal structure and the cosmic order of creation. At the most practical level, the 7 palaces also form a meditative map for the mystic. The Ari describes certain contemplations and kavanot, mystical intentions that correspond to each palace. By meditating upon them, the practitioner can enact a spiritual ascent, entering each palace in turn and refining the soul. This is a deeply experiential teaching. The 7 palaces are not merely philosophical abstractions, but lived realities of the mystical path. They are a guide for the inner work of the soul, a path of purification and illumination. To fully understand the 7 palaces, one must situate them within the broader context of Lurianic Kabbalah. This system begins with the doctrine of Tzimtzum, the self-contraction of the infinite light, or Ein Sof, in order to make space for creation. From this contraction emerges the first emanations, the Kav, a thin ray of divine light, which begins the process of forming the worlds. These worlds are structured in terms of the Sephirot, divine attributes through which creation comes into being. But in the process, the vessels intended to contain the light are shattered, scattering divine sparks throughout creation. The shattering creates the state of exile in which the worlds exist. The work of the mystic and of creation itself is to gather these sparks and restore them to their source. The 7 palaces describe precisely this process of gathering and ascent. They are the inner structure of this rectification. Each palace is a chamber in which the soul gathers a certain measure of divine light, a stage in which it purifies a certain aspect of its being, and a step closer to the ultimate unification with the infinite. They are the ladder of Jacob's vision transposed into the deepest architecture of the soul. Understanding the 7 palaces thus requires a fusion of Kabbalistic cosmology, mystical psychology, and practical theurgy. They are not an abstract doctrine but a living teaching of the Ari, a map of the soul's journey through the hidden chambers of the divine. They are the spiritual architecture of the path of return, the chambers through which the soul must pass to reach the fullness of redemption. They stand as a central pillar of the Ari's mystical system, a profound synthesis of the deepest currents of Jewish mysticism brought together in one luminous vision. The 7 palaces of the Ari are not simply numbered levels. They are intricate chambers of mystical significance, each with its own structure, its own divine light, its own rectifications, and its own place within the soul's ascent. Each palace corresponds to specific Sephirot, levels of the soul, and mystical intentions, kavanot, and each is a stage in the soul's path of purification and return to the infinite. To understand the palaces is to understand the architecture of the soul and the map of cosmic tikkun itself. The first palace, foundations of the soul. The first palace, Hekel Rishon, is the chamber of the soul's most foundational layer. In the terms of Kabbalah, it corresponds to the level of Nefesh, the animating soul. Nefesh is the lowest level of the soul, the life force that animates the body and connects to the physical world. This palace is the first chamber the soul inhabits upon its descent into creation, and the first to be purified in the ascent. Cosmologically, the first palace corresponds to the Sephirah of Malchut, the vessel of receptivity. Malchut is the gateway through which divine light enters the created world. The palace therefore symbolizes the soul's opening to divine illumination. It is the chamber of grounding and the rectification of the soul's initial connection to existence. In Lurianic meditation, the practitioner contemplates this palace as the first step in gathering the sparks of holiness dispersed in the physical realm. The kavanot here are directed toward purifying the soul's will and establishing the proper orientation toward God. The first palace is thus the threshold of the ascent, the foundation upon which all higher chambers are built. The second palace, the chamber of will. The second palace, Hekel Shini, corresponds to Ruach, the level of the soul associated with emotion, moral sensibility, and intellect. In the Sephirotic structure, this palace is linked with Yesod, the channel of connection between the spiritual and the physical. Yesod is the foundation upon which spiritual energies are gathered and transmitted, and thus the second palace is the chamber in which the soul begins to consolidate its inner powers and harmonize them with divine purpose. Here the task is the rectification of the soul's emotional faculties, aligning them with divine will. In meditation, the seeker enters this chamber to gather the sparks of holiness connected to human feelings, desires, and intentions. The second palace is the chamber of self-discipline, the inner training of the soul, so that it can ascend further without distortion. The Ari teaches that this palace is a crucible of refinement, where the soul's will is tested and purified. The third palace, the chamber of understanding. The third palace, Hekel Shlishi, corresponds to the level of Neshama, the soul's higher intellect and divine insight. This palace is connected to Tiferet, the Sephir of harmony, beauty, and truth. Tiferet stands at the center of the Sephirotic tree, balancing the forces of mercy and judgment, and the third palace reflects this harmony. In this chamber, the soul's inner faculties of discernment and insight are purified. It is the place of intellectual illumination, where divine wisdom is integrated with the soul's experience. The meditations here focus on uniting the intellect with the higher will of the soul and rectifying the distortions that arise from pride or false knowledge. This palace represents the soul's awakening to a deeper comprehension of the divine order. The fourth palace, the chamber of union. The fourth palace, Hekel Revi'i, is the chamber of the soul's union with higher divine reality. It corresponds to Jevira, the Sephira of divine strength, discipline, and restraint, and also to higher levels of Neshama. This palace is the chamber of purification through contraction, of removing excess and creating the space for true union with God. The Ari describes this palace as a realm in which the soul learns to empty itself of ego and self-will to become receptive to the pure divine light. This is a chamber of preparation for the higher chambers to follow, a chamber in which the soul is tested in its capacity for humility and surrender. Meditative practices here involve intense covenant of self-nullification, aligning the soul's will entirely with the divine will. The fifth palace, the chamber of revelation. The fifth palace, Hekel Chamishi, corresponds to Chizd, the Sephira of divine love and benevolence. At this level, the soul experiences revelation, the opening of a chamber in which divine light shines forth in its fullness. This palace is a realm of expansive illumination, where the soul receives a deeper and more encompassing vision of the divine. The rectification here involves aligning the soul's capacity for reception with the capacity for giving. The soul learns to hold divine light without distortion, transforming the experience of revelation into a living capacity for blessing and generosity. The meditations of this palace involve contemplation of divine compassion and the harmonizing of mercy with truth. The sixth palace, the chamber of ascension. The sixth palace, Hekel Shishi, corresponds to Netzach and Hod, the Sephirot associated with endurance, victory, and divine splendor. This palace represents the soul's ascent beyond itself toward the higher dimensions of divine reality. It is the chamber of preparation for the ultimate union, where the soul transcends the limitations of separation and enters into the experience of the higher worlds. In this chamber, the rectification involves overcoming all forms of inner resistance and limitation. The meditative focus here is on attuning the soul to the higher harmonies of creation and opening to the flow of divine ascent. This palace is the last chamber before the soul enters the seventh and highest realm. The seventh palace, the chamber of unity. The seventh palace, Hekel Shivii, is the culmination of the soul's journey. It corresponds to Keter, the Sephira of divine will, unity, and absolute consciousness. This palace is the innermost chamber of the soul, where all separation dissolves and the soul becomes one with the infinite. This is the chamber of ultimate rectification, the completion of the tikkun process. Here, the soul gathers all the sparks it has purified in the lower chambers and returns them to their source. The meditations of this palace are those of union and complete self-nullification, where the soul enters a state of pure divine awareness. In Lurianic terms, this is the soul's return to its origin before Tzimtzum, the return to absolute unity with Ein Sof. At this point, we have traversed the seven palaces as a conceptual structure. What remains is to understand them not only as stages of ascent, but as an integrated system, a living architecture of the soul. The Ari's vision of the seven palaces is a map for the inner journey of rectification, an inner pilgrimage, in which the soul gathers its scattered lights and returns to its source. This pilgrimage is not linear in the simple sense, but a spiraling ascent, in which the soul revisits the chambers and deeper levels of refinement. This ascent is the mystical fulfillment of creation itself. The cosmic drama of Tzimtzum, Sha'ar HaGilgulim, and Tikkun is mirrored in the soul's journey through the seven palaces. The palaces are the microcosm of the worlds, the soul is a mirror of creation. Thus, the teaching of the 7 palaces is not merely mystical psychology but the very heart of the Ari's Kabbalah, the teaching of how creation returns to the infinite. The 7 palaces of the Ari represent an integrated mystical system in which the ascent of the soul mirrors the structure of creation itself, a living map of rectification in which each chamber embodies a stage of refinement and a corresponding aspect of divine reality. These palaces are not merely sequential stations, but concentric realms of the soul, each with its own sephirotic correspondence, level of the soul, and set of mystical intentions, Kavanah. The first palace corresponds to Malchut, the Sephira of receptivity and manifestation, and is the chamber of the soul's nefesh, the animating life force rooted in the physical world. It is the threshold where the soul begins its purification by grounding itself in divine presence, aligning the will to receive holiness and initiating the rectification of Malchut itself. The second palace corresponds to Yesod, the channel of divine connection, and houses the soul's ruach, the emotional and volitional faculties. Here the soul undergoes a process of harmonizing desire with divine purpose, cultivating self-discipline, refining the emotional will so it may transmit the light of the higher worlds without distortion. The third palace corresponds to Tiferet, the Sephira of harmony and truth, and is the chamber of the Neshama, the higher intellect. In this realm the soul is purified through the illumination of insight, aligning understanding with divine order, rectifying false knowledge, and attaining the ability to perceive reality in its balanced and harmonious truth. The fourth palace corresponds to Jevira, the Sephira of discipline and restriction, and also belongs to the Neshama. It is the chamber of contraction and purification, where the soul must empty itself of ego and self-will, submitting wholly to divine sovereignty so as to prepare for the deeper union of the higher chambers, and where the rectification is the alignment of the will through self-nullification and surrender. The fifth palace corresponds to Chizd, the Sephira of expansive loving kindness, and belongs to the level of Chaya, the soul's living essence. It is the chamber of revelation, where divine light shines forth fully, and the rectification lies in receiving revelation without distortion, transforming illumination into the capacity for compassion and blessing, aligning the soul's receptivity with the infinite flow of divine mercy. The sixth palace corresponds to Netzach and Hod, the Sephirot of endurance, victory, and divine splendor, and belongs to the level of Yechidah, the soul's unity. It is the chamber of ascent where the soul transcends limitation, overcoming resistance, and preparing for the ultimate stage of union, cultivating endurance and receptivity to the harmonies of divine ascent. The seventh palace corresponds to Keter, the crown of unity and absolute divine will, and is the innermost chamber of the soul, the level of Yechidah in its purest form. It is the chamber of ultimate rectification, the culmination of the soul's pilgrimage, where all separation dissolves. All scattered sparks are gathered, and the soul returns to its origin, entering a state of pure divine awareness and absolute unity with Ein Sof. In the Lurianic vision, these palaces are simultaneously stages of ascent for the individual soul and mirrors of the cosmic process of Tzimtzum, Sheveret HaKelim, and Tikkun, so that the soul's journey becomes the microcosm of creation's return to its source. The palaces are chambers of mystical transformation in which the seeker works with specific kavanah, precise meditative orientations that correspond to the rectifications of each sephira and each level of the soul. These intentions are not abstract thoughts but living spiritual states, cultivated through contemplation, prayer, and theurgical practice, designed to align the soul's faculties with the divine structure of reality. In this way, the ascent through the 7 palaces is not merely a spiritual exercise, but a theurgical operation in which the soul participates in the cosmic process of rectification, gathering and elevating the sparks of holiness until it attains its ultimate purpose, unity with the infinite. This teaching of the Ari transforms the 7 palaces into a sacred architecture of the soul, a detailed map for the inner pilgrimage, and a practical guide for the aspirant who wishes to walk the path of true mystical ascent. To dwell in the palaces is to dwell in the process of tikkun, to live the drama of creation and redemption, and to enact in one's own soul the great return to the divine source. The practical application of the 7 palaces in Lurianic Kabbalah transforms them from an abstract cosmology into a concrete theurgical path, a set of meditative and ritual techniques by which the seeker enters into the chambers of the soul and ascends toward ultimate unity. This practical dimension is central to the teaching of the Ari, who presents the palaces as a structured system of ascent, each palace requiring specific preparation, covenant, and purification before the aspirant may enter the next. The ascent begins with careful grounding in the physical and ethical realms, for the Ari insists that the lower levels of the soul, particularly the nefesh of the first palace, must be rectified through ethical refinement and Torah observance before the higher chambers can be accessed. This involves daily acts of self-rectification, prayer, mitzvot, and the purification of speech, thought, and deed so that the soul becomes a vessel ready to receive divine light. The practical work of entering the first palace is thus deeply ethical and preparatory. The seeker engages in prayer with covenant focused on malchut and nefesh, visualizing the self as a purified vessel, meditating on the rectification of the lowest, sephira, and aligning the will to receive divine illumination without distortion. The second palace involves a deeper level of inner work, for it requires refinement of the ruach and the emotional will. Here the seeker enters a meditative practice in which one contemplates the channel of Yesod, visualizing the soul as a conduit for divine light, cultivating emotional purity, self-discipline, and the alignment of desire with the divine. The covenant of the second palace often involve intense meditation on divine attributes such as Chesed and Jevira as they operate within Yesod, balancing expansion and contraction, mercy and discipline, so that the emotional will becomes a harmonious vessel for ascent. The third palace, the chamber of understanding, demands the meditative purification of the neshama. Here the aspirant engages in contemplations that align the intellect with the light of Tiferet, perceiving the unity within multiplicity, discerning the truth beyond illusion, and rectifying the distortions of pride or false knowledge. The covenant here involve meditations on divine harmony and the contemplation of sacred texts, often combined with the use of divine names and permutations as taught by the Ari, so as to open the higher mind to the revelation of truth. Entering the fourth palace requires the practice of deep self-nullification and surrender, for it is the chamber of Jevira and contraction. The seeker engages in theurgical preparation through meditation on the divine attribute of restraint, visualizing the soul, shedding all self-will, contemplating the nature of divine sovereignty, and cultivating humility. The stage often involves advanced meditative techniques. The unification of the divine names, silent contemplation, and covenant of surrender that prepare the soul for the reception of revelation. The fifth palace, the chamber of revelation, is entered through covenant directed toward Chesed, the sephira of divine love and expansion. The aspirant cultivates a state of openness to divine illumination, visualizing the self as a vessel filled with the light of revelation, aligning the will with infinite compassion, and transforming the reception of divine light into an active flow of blessing. This stage often involves the recitation of specific psalms, the invocation of holy names, and meditation on the unifying love of God, as a preparation to receive the illumination of higher chambers. The sixth palace, the chamber of ascent, involves meditative practices that attune the soul to the harmonies of Netzach and Hod, the sephirot of endurance, victory, and splendor. Here the seeker cultivates perseverance and spiritual readiness for the final union, meditating on the ascent itself, overcoming the last vestiges of ego and resistance, and attuning to the rhythm of the divine will. This stage is a crucible of transformation in which the soul's faculties are purified to receive the ultimate light. Finally, entering the seventh palace, the chamber of unity, requires the culmination of all preparation, the full rectification of all the lower chambers, and the attainment of the covenant of Keter, absolute will, and unity. This stage is the theurgical fulfillment of the soul's journey, where the aspirant meditates in the silence, beyond thought, nullifying all separation, gathering all the sparks of holiness into a unified whole, and entering the state of Yechidah, in which the soul becomes one with the infinite. This final ascent is not merely an inner attainment, but the ultimate theurgical act, the fulfillment of creation's return to God. In practical terms, the Ari teaches that this ascent through the palaces is realized not as a single event, but as a lifetime of disciplined mystical work, involving stages of preparation, meditation, and theurgical invocation, each palace becoming a living chamber that the seeker must dwell in and pass through. The entire process is embedded in the rhythm of Torah, prayer, covenant, and the observance of mitzvot, so that the ascent becomes not only a mystical attainment but the practical embodiment of the cosmic process of tikkun, the rectification of the worlds, through the rectification of the soul itself. Thus, the 7 palaces in their practical application are both a path and a method, a map of ascent and a living praxis of mystical transformation, offering to the aspirant a structured way to enter into the divine chambers, purify the soul, and realize the ultimate goal of union with the infinite. The 7 palaces of the Ari, when considered as an integrated whole, are not merely a mystical map of ascent for the individual soul, but the living embodiment of the entire Lurianic drama of creation, the paradigmatic structure of the universe's origin, fall, and ultimate redemption. They constitute an inner theurgy in miniature, a microcosmic reflection of the macrocosmic process of Tzimtzum, the divine contraction that made space for creation, and of Sha'ar HaGilgulim, the shattering of the vessels that scattered divine sparks into the realms, and finally of Tikkun, the restoration of all things to their primal unity. In this vision, the 7 palaces are the chambers of cosmic return, the stages through which the soul participates in the great work of regathering and rectifying those scattered sparks. They are the chambers in which the soul's journey mirrors creation's own journey, the chambers in which the drama of exile and return is enacted. This is why the palaces correspond so precisely to the Sephirotic order and to the levels of the soul. They are the theurgical architecture of reality itself, each palace a Sephira and each Sephira chamber in the palace of the soul. From the lowest chamber of Malchut, where the soul first begins to awaken to its divine potential through grounding and ethical refinement, up through the higher chambers of Yesod, Tiferet, Jevira, Chizd, Netzach Had, and finally Keter, the palaces represent the progressive stages of rectification, each a transformation of the soul's capacity to receive and contain the divine light. This progression is itself a symbolic reenactment of Tikkun, for just as the Sephirot must be rectified in order to restore harmony to the world, so the chambers of the soul must be purified for the soul to reunite with its source. In this way, the ascent through the palaces is not merely personal but cosmic. Each act of mystical purification is also an act of universal rectification, a contribution to the restoration of the worlds. This is why the Ari describes the path through the palaces as a sacred theurgy, a structured, meditative, and prayerful participation in the divine will, because each palace is a stage of the soul's cooperation with creation's ultimate purpose. The cabinet of each palace are not incidental, but the very means by which the soul aligns itself with the divine order. They are precise contemplations, meditations on divine names and attributes, recitations of psalms, and visualizations of the Sephirot, corresponding to the palace, designed to attune the soul's faculties to the light of that chamber and to prepare it for the next stage of ascent. This work of cabinet transforms the ascent into a living prayer, a theurgical operation in which the soul moves inward through the concentric chambers until it arrives at the final chamber of Keter, the Palace of Unity, in which all multiplicity dissolves, all distinctions, 8. And the soul stands in the silence of pure divine presence. For the Ari, this final palace is not merely the goal of the ascent, but the culmination of creation itself, the eschatological vision of a world restored, the unification of all things in the will of God, the rectification of all souls, and the return of creation to the harmony of its origin. In this sense, the 7 palaces are both a map and a prophecy, a structure of ascent and a vision of the end of days. They reveal that the path of the soul is the path of the world, and that the individual's mystical work is inseparable from the cosmic work of redemption. This is why the Ari's teaching on the 7 palaces is so central to his entire mystical system. It encapsulates the union of microcosm and macrocosm, of inner ascent in cosmic restoration, of personal transformation in universal tikkun. Indwelling within these palaces through prayer, cabinet, meditation, and theurgical practice, the seeker does not merely traverse a symbolic ladder of the soul, but participates in the living drama of creation and redemption itself, stepping into the chambers of divine presence and making real the vision of a perfected world in which all is restored to unity, and the soul returns to the infinite light of Ein Sof. Thus, the 7 palaces are not only the structure of the soul's ascent, but the architecture of the world's return, the sacred design in which the journey of every soul is written as part of the divine plan, a theurgical pilgrimage in which every step of purification is at once a movement toward God and a contribution to the restoration of all creation. The first palace, the chamber of Malchut in the Nefesh, is the gateway of the soul's ascent and the foundational stage of the mystical pilgrimage, for it represents the rectification of the world of action, Alam Hasiya. The purification of the soul's grounding in the physical realm. Symbolically, Malchut is the receptacle of all divine light, the vessel that receives and transmits the flow of the higher Sephirot, and in the first palace the seeker begins the theurgical work of aligning the lowest chamber of the soul with divine order, gathering the spark scattered in the material realm through ethical refinement, Torah study, prayer, and the observance of mitzvot. The Covenant here focus on transforming the nefeshes, will through mindfulness of divine presence in all acts, cultivating purity of speech, thought, and deed so that every action becomes an offering, a vessel for holiness. The practical meditation involves visualizing the self as a radiant vessel filled with light descending from above, aligning the will to receive divine blessing, and affirming the sanctification of life through constant intention. The second palace corresponds to Yesod and the Ruach, the soul's emotional and volitional faculty, and is the chamber of the channel, where the soul learns to harmonize desire with divine purpose. Yesod, as the foundation and conduit of divine flow, is the place where the soul must refine its emotional will, transforming desires into pure receptivity, and the Covenant of this palace direct the aspirant toward contemplations on balance, harmony, and the flow of divine light. Meditative practice here includes focusing on the attribute of Yesod as the channel through which divine compassion flows, visualizing the soul as a conduit transmitting light upward and downward, and reciting divine names that align the emotional faculty with higher harmony, thus preparing the soul for the illumination of the higher chambers. The third palace, corresponding to Tiferet in the Neshama, is the chamber of truth and beauty, where the soul attains a higher intellect illumined by harmony. In this stage, the seeker engages in contemplation of the Sephirah of Tiferet as the unifying heart of the Sephirotic structure, where mercy and judgment meet in balance, and the Covenant focus on the rectification of false knowledge and the cultivation of divine insight. The meditations involve deep study of sacred texts, the contemplation of divine harmony, and the invocation of specific divine names and permutations to open the higher mind to the truth beyond multiplicity, thereby aligning the soul's understanding with the living harmony of creation. The fourth palace, corresponding to Jevurah and the Neshama, is the chamber of contraction, discipline, and self-nullification, where the soul must empty itself of self-will to prepare for higher union. This chamber is a crucible of purification, the place where pride and resistance are stripped away through contemplative surrender, and the Covenant involve meditations on divine sovereignty, restraint, and the nature of self-annihilation in God. Practical work here includes silence, deep contemplation, and the unification of divine names that embody contraction, aligning the soul with the discipline necessary for ascent, and thus preparing the way for the reception of revelation in the higher palaces. The fifth palace, corresponding to Chizd and Chaya, is the chamber of revelation, where the soul attains the capacity for divine compassion and illumination. Chizd as expansive love is the channel through which revelation flows, and the Covenant of this palace focus on aligning the soul with the infinite flow of mercy, blessing, and divine presence. Meditation here involves visualizing the soul immersed in divine light, contemplating the nature of compassion as the expression of unity, reciting psalms of illumination, and invoking divine names that open the heart to receive revelation, thereby enabling the soul to dwell in the luminous chamber of Chizd and prepare for the final ascent. The sixth palace, corresponding to Netzach and Hod and the level of Yechidah, is the chamber of endurance, victory, and the harmonies of ascent, where the soul transcends limitation and prepares for ultimate union. Here the Covenant involve meditation on the harmonies of the Sephirot, endurance in the face of resistance, the alignment of all faculties toward the singular goal of unification with the divine will. Practical meditation includes visualizing the ascent as a movement of concentric light, invoking divine names that embody victory and endurance, and attuning the soul to the rhythm of divine ascent so that it may overcome the final barriers before union. The seventh palace, corresponding to Keter and Yechidah in its purest form, is the chamber of unity, the innermost sanctuary of the soul in which all distinctions dissolve and the seeker enters the state of absolute divine presence. This is the goal of the entire ascent, the fulfillment of the cosmic drama of Tikkun. The moment when the soul gathers all scattered sparks and returns to its source. Covenant here are contemplations of divine unity, silence, and unification, and meditative practice involves complete stillness beyond thought, visualization of the self as merging into the infinite light of Ein Sof, and the invocation of the highest divine names as a theurgical act of union. This final palace is not merely the soul's goal but the consummation of creation itself, the vision of redemption in which all things are restored, and the ascent through the 7 palaces is revealed as the inner path of the world's ultimate return to God. Taken together, these 7 chambers constitute not only a mystical map of ascent, but a comprehensive spiritual discipline, a living praxis in which meditation, prayer, covenant, and ethical refinement converge to enact the cosmic process of rectification. Each palace is both a stage of purification and a threshold to a higher reality, and the theurgical work of entering them is the soul's participation in the great work of creation, the sacred journey of returning home to the divine source, a journey in which the individual soul becomes a vessel of the ultimate unification that the Ari envisions as the final purpose of existence. The 7 palaces of the Ari, when held together as a single living vision, emerge as a sublime and unified structure, not merely a mystical framework for ascent, but the very architecture of existence, the inner map of the soul, that mirrors the outer map of creation, revealing the deep truth that the path of the soul and the path of the world are one. They are the chambers of the great theurgical temple in which the drama of Tzimtzum, Sha'ar HaGilgulim, and Tikkun is enacted in miniature, a microcosm of the cosmic process of exile and return, shattering and restoration, contraction and expansion, in which the soul's purification is also the rectification of the worlds. Seen in their fullness, the palaces are the stages of a single movement, the movement of the soul returning to its source, and each palace is at once a chamber of ascent and a mirror of the Sephirotic world, a symbolic embodiment of divine attributes that must be pure. In turn, Malchut is the grounding of the will, Yesod is the harmonizing channel of desire, Tiferet as the illumination of understanding, Gevurah as the discipline of surrender, Chesed as the revelation of compassion, Netzach and Hod as the harmonies of endurance, and Victory and Keter as the final unification of all. Together they form an integrated path of the soul's transformation, a sacred staircase through which the seeker moves inward toward the silence of absolute divine presence. In the teaching of the Ari, this ascent is not theoretical but practical, the living theurgy of covenant, prayer, meditation, and ethical refinement. It is a disciplined journey in which each palace is entered through purification of the soul's faculties, each stage preparing the way for the next, and each act of mystical work both an inner movement and an act of cosmic rectification. The covenant of each palace are the keys that open its threshold, the contemplations and theurgical intentions that align the soul with the sephira it corresponds to, and the meditative practices are the living embodiment of the mystical ascent, transforming the path into an active union with divine will. The consummation of this journey is the entrance into the 7th palace, the chamber of Keter and Yechidah, where all distinctions are dissolved and the soul stands in the unmediated light of Ein Sof, the absolute unity beyond thought and form. This final chamber is the goal of the ascent and the heart of the Ari's mystical vision. It is the moment of cosmic fulfillment in which the individual's return to God becomes the return of all creation, the full realization of Tikkun and the eschatological vision of redemption. Thus the 7 palaces are not only a map of ascent, but the living heart of Lurianic mysticism, a complete theurgical system that unites meditation, prayer, covenant, and ethical refinement in the service of a higher purpose, the rectification of the soul, the restoration of the Sephirot, and the return of all things to the infinite light from which they came. They are the architecture of the soul's pilgrimage and the structure of creation's return, the chambers through which the seeker must pass in order to re-enter the unity of the divine presence, and they stand as the Ari's profound teaching, that the path of the mystic is inseparable from the path of the world, that the ascent of the soul is the ascent of creation, and that every step in purification, every meditation of Kavanah, every act of ethical refinement, is a step toward the great fulfillment in which all is gathered together in the unity of God. In this final vision, the 7 palaces are revealed as not merely mystical chambers, but as living portals of transformation, the sacred architecture of ascent, and the heart of the Ari's teaching on the ultimate purpose of existence, the return of all creation to the infinite light, the restoration of harmony, and the entrance of the soul into the eternal palace of God. The doctrine of the seven palaces, Shiva HaGilgulim, in the teaching of the Ari, Rabbi Isaac Luria, represents one of the most profound syntheses of Kabbalistic thought, uniting the deepest mysteries of the soul with the cosmic drama of creation, exile, and redemption. Rooted in the inner vision of the Ari's Lurianic system, the vision of Tzimtzum, divine contraction, Sha'ar HaGilgulim, the shattering of the vessels, and Tikkun, restoration, the seven palaces are not mere mystical symbols but a living map of the soul's ascent, theurgical structure of return in which the journey inward is the journey of the worlds themselves. They are the chambers of the soul that mirror the chambers of creation, the concentric halls of an inner temple through which the soul ascends toward the ultimate dwelling place of divine unity. Each palace corresponds to a level of the soul and to a sephira, and together they form an integrated path of purification, meditation, and transformation. The teaching of the Ari reveals that the ascent through these chambers is at once a personal pilgrimage and a cosmic operation. The purification of the soul is the rectification of the worlds. The palaces themselves are the theurgical architecture of existence, reflecting the hidden structure of creation in miniature. They represent the stages through which the soul must pass in order to gather the scattered sparks of holiness and return to the source. Entering them is to participate in the divine drama, to join the work of Tikkun, and to enact in one's own being the process by which creation itself is restored. In the path of the seven palaces, the aspirant's journey mirrors the structure of the Sephirot. The lowest palace corresponds to Malchut, the receptacle of all light, ascending through Yesod, Tiferet, Jevira, Chizd, Netzach, Had, and Keter. The soul moves through a progressive refinement of will, emotion, intellect, discipline, revelation, harmony, and unity. This ascent is both a mystical discipline and a divine service, a theurgical operation in which covenant, focused intentions, prayer, meditation, and ethical refinement converge to align the soul with the divine will and to prepare it for union with God. In this way, the seven palaces are not only a map of ascent, but also a vision of the ultimate purpose of existence, a path of return in which the individual becomes a living vessel of the cosmic restoration. The teaching begins with the first palace, corresponding to Malchut in the Nefesh, the soul's lowest faculty, the grounding of will in the physical world. This palace is the gateway of the ascent, the chamber in which the soul begins its purification through ethical refinement and mindful intention, sanctifying life in the realm of action. It is the place of rectifying Malchut, gathering the sparks scattered in the material world, and aligning the soul's will to receive divine blessing. The covenant here are meditations on the sanctity of action and the presence of God in the everyday, visualizing the self as a vessel of light filled from above, affirming the unity of the mundane and the holy. The second palace corresponds to Yesod and the Ruach, the emotional faculty, the channel through which divine flow passes. Here the soul learns harmony, aligning desire with divine purpose, transforming longing into receptivity. The chamber of Yesod is the place of refining emotional will, attuning it to the flow of compassion and truth. The covenant of this stage direct the seeker toward contemplations on harmony and balance, visualizing the soul as a conduit transmitting divine light upward and downward, reciting divine names that attune the heart and will to the higher order. The third palace, corresponding to Tiferet and the Neshama, is the chamber of beauty and truth, where intellect is illumined by harmony. In this stage the seeker contemplates the heart of the Sephirotic order, where mercy and judgment meet. The soul learns to transcend partial knowledge and open itself to divine insight, aligning understanding with the harmony of creation. The meditative practice here involves deep contemplation, study of sacred texts, invocation of divine names, and visualization of the soul immersed in radiant truth. The fourth palace, corresponding to Jevira and the Neshama, is the chamber of contraction and discipline, the crucible of purification. Here the soul must shed pride and self-will, surrendering to divine sovereignty. The covenant focus on self-nullification and the nature of restriction as a pathway to freedom, meditating on the discipline necessary for ascent, invoking divine names of contraction, and cultivating silence and inner stillness. This is the chamber in which the soul is purified for the higher revelation to come. The fifth palace corresponds to Chizd and Chaya, the chamber of revelation and divine compassion. Here the soul attains capacity for illumination and blessing, opening itself to the infinite flow of mercy. The cabinet involve contemplation of divine loving-kindness, visualizations of the soul immersed in light, recitation of psalms of illumination, and invocation of names that open the heart to revelation. In this chamber the soul dwells in expansive communion with the divine, preparing for the final stages of ascent. The sixth palace, corresponding to Netzach and Hod and the level of Yechida, is the chamber of endurance and victory, the harmonies of ascent. The soul here transcends limitation, attuning all faculties to the single purpose of unity with God. Cabinet focus on harmonizing the soul's faculties, meditations on victory and perseverance, visualization of concentric ascending light, and invocation of divine names that embody endurance. This palace is the threshold to the ultimate union. The seventh palace, corresponding to Keter and Yechida, is the innermost sanctuary, the palace of unity itself. Here all distinctions dissolve, and the soul stands in the unmediated presence of Ein Sof, beyond thought and form. This is the goal of ascent, the consummation of creation, the fulfillment of tikkun. The cabinet here are contemplations of absolute unity, silence, and unification, visualization of merging into the infinite light, and invocation of the highest divine names. The ascent through the seven palaces is thus revealed as both a mystical discipline and a cosmic operation, the path of the soul and the path of creation intertwined, each act of purification a step toward universal restoration. In the teaching of the Ari, the seven palaces are not only a map of mystical ascent, but the living architecture of existence itself, the chambers of the soul and of the worlds, the concentric halls of the great temple of return in which the drama of Tzimtzum, exile, and redemption is enacted. They stand as the profound teaching that the work of the mystic is the work of the world, that the ascent of the soul is the ascent of creation, and that every cabinet, every prayer, every act of refinement is a step in the great theurgical work of Tikkun Olam. Thus the seven palaces of the Ari are not merely mystical chambers, but living portals of transformation, the sacred architecture of ascent, and the heart of the Ari's vision, that all creation is a pilgrimage of return, and that soul's ultimate dwelling is within the eternal palace of God, the infinite light of unity from which all existence flows and to which all shall return. The seven palaces of the Ari correspond to a living system of mystical correspondences, each palace aligned with a particular sephira, a faculty of the soul, a theme of kavana, angelic mediation, and a specific meditative practice, forming a complete map for the theurgical ascent. The first palace corresponds to Malchut, the lowest sephira, and the faculty of the nefesh, the soul's grounding will expressed in action. Its kavana theme is the sanctification of action, grounding divine presence in the physical world, and it is mediated by the angel Sandalphon, who presides over the grounding of prayer and divine influx. The meditative practice of this palace is to visualize the self as a vessel of light receiving the divine, affirming the unity of all action as sacred, and cultivating mindful ethical refinement in daily life, thereby gathering scattered sparks and aligning the will with divine purpose. The second palace corresponds to Yesod and the Ruach, the emotional faculty and channel of divine flow. Its kavana is the harmonizing of desire with divine will, purifying emotional intent, and is under the angelic mediation of Gabriel, who brings revelation and harmony. Meditation here involves visualizing the soul as a luminous channel transmitting divine light, reciting divine names of harmony, and cultivating emotional openness to the flow of mercy, aligning longing with the higher will. The third palace corresponds to Tiferet and the Neshama, the higher intellectual faculty where beauty, truth, and harmony converge. Its kavana is the contemplation of divine harmony and the purification of knowledge, under the guidance of Raphael Kama, the angel of healing and truth. Meditative practice here includes the deep study of sacred texts, visualization of the soul immersed in radiant truth, recitation of divine names that open the intellect, and contemplation on the balance of mercy and judgment in the inner life. The fourth palace corresponds to Jevira and the Neshama faculty of discipline and contraction, its kavana the self-nullification and surrender to divine will, purification through discipline, and its angelic correspondent as Camiel, angel of strength and divine order. Meditation here involves cultivating silence and stillness, visualizing the shedding of pride and resistance, reciting names of contraction and contemplating the mystery of divine sovereignty and restraint. The fifth palace corresponds to Chizd and the Chaya, the faculty of expansive revealed life, its kavana the revelation of mercy and illumination of the heart, and is mediated by Zadkiel, angel of mercy and compassion. Meditative practice in this palace consists of visualizing immersion in divine light, reciting psalms of illumination, invoking divine names of blessing, and dwelling in the expansive experience of loving kindness as preparation for the higher ascent. The sixth palace corresponds to Netzach and Hod, and to Yechida, the faculty of unity, endurance, and victory, with the kavana focused on harmonizing all faculties of the soul in preparation for the highest union, mediated by the angels Haniel and Michael, who embody victory and divine harmony. Meditation here is the harmonizing of the soul's faculties through visualization of ascending light, recitation of names of endurance and victory, and contemplation on the harmonies that carry the soul beyond limitation toward divine unity. Finally, the seventh palace corresponds to Keter and Yechida itself, the innermost chamber of the soul where all distinctions dissolve into the infinite. Its kavana is the contemplation of absolute unity and unification with the Ein Sof, under the mediation of the archangel Metatron, the voice of divine presence. The meditative practice of this ultimate palace is the visualization of merging into boundless light, the silent contemplation of the absolute, the recitation of the highest divine names, and the immersion of the soul in the pure unity beyond thought and form. Together, these correspondences form a complete theurgical framework, a living map for the aspirant to enter the seven palaces in sequence, purifying the will, harmonizing desire, illuminating the intellect, surrendering to divine discipline, opening to mercy, harmonizing the soul's faculties, and ultimately dissolving into the unity of the divine presence, thereby enacting the great work of Tikkun Olam in the soul and in all creation.